Today's story is a prime example showing that even though someone might appear to be this selfless and charitable person, deep down their motivations might be guided by something much more dark and sinister. Now with that said, I am your host, Uriah Baker, and welcome to Tales of the Clockwork. "14-year-old Cameron Harding was reading a book in his room, but he wasn't really reading. He was just looking at the pages. Periodically, he would put the book down, stare at the ceiling, sort of look around the room, and then back at his book. He tried to distract himself from all the commotion that was going on downstairs, and there had been a lot of it over the last week, but it was just impossible for him to focus, and today was particularly worse than the others. Cameron heard his mother crying from all the way downstairs. It wasn't normal crying either. She was basically screaming and full-on sobbing. His father, though, was completely silent during all of this. Over the next few hours, the sound of his mother crying soon turned to sniffles and then turned to silence. He put his book across his chest, laid on his bed, and stared up at the ceiling while he heard the footsteps coming up his stairs. Cameron heard the knock on his door, but he didn't respond. After a few moments, his parents just walked into the room and sat on the bed on either side of him. They frequently would come into his room to give him updates over the last week, but they rarely ever came in together. So Cameron sat up in his bed waiting to hear the update when his mother gave him a big hug and began crying again. His father wrapped his arms around both of them, and with a shaky voice, he said, "They found her. She's gone." 8 days earlier, Cameron met up with his 17-year-old sister Ophelia after school. Usually, the two of them would walk home together, but Cameron told her that he would be staying after school for a little bit to do some schoolwork with his friends. When Cameron returned home that evening, his parents asked him if Ophelia was with him, but he told them that she left right after school and he hadn't seen her since. The parents got in contact with a few of Ophelia's close friends, but nobody had seen her. Later that night, the parents filed a missing person report, and initially authorities told the parents, let's just wait a day, see if she comes back, and assured them that the situation was likely that this was just an upset teenager that left home and would be coming back within a day or two. But Cameron's mother insisted very heavily that this was not typical behavior of Ophelia, and she demanded that the police do something immediately. Early the next morning, an extensive search was launched, focusing on the area around the route that Ophelia walked to and from school each day. A team of detectives went door to door to see if anybody had seen Ophelia walking home that day, but nobody had seen anything and they didn't get any leads. It wasn't until 7 days later that two hunters were in a pretty remote location about 2 miles outside of the town when they saw this bright blue thing laying up against a tree. As they got closer, the hunters saw what this was, and one of them immediately left to go get help. When officers arrived, they found Ophelia deceased, laying face down against a tree. A search of the area revealed that someone had attempted to dig a hole to place the body in, but had abandoned the process partway through. When her body was analyzed, it was determined that she likely died the same day that she went missing, but it was unclear how long her body had actually been in the area where it had been found. Now, in a lot of ways, Cameron felt really guilty about what happened to his sister. He usually walked home with her after school, and so he would continually play these scenarios over and over in his head of what might have happened the day that Ophelia went missing. His guilt and growing depression were completely consuming him. Eventually, his parents took him to see a therapist, but for the most part, Cameron didn't bother talking during these sessions. In one of the very few times that Cameron spoke during these initial meetings, he told the therapist that he wasn't good at art, but the therapist insisted that he give it a try and come back with something that he created for their session next week. So the next week, when Cameron returned, his therapist asked him if he had done any artwork and brought something with him. Cameron was a little bit hesitant, but ultimately he said, yes, I did make something, but he wasn't really sure if he wanted to show it yet. He was very nervous and insisted that it wasn't finished yet, it was full of flaws, he needed to fix some of the details, but he did end up taking out his drawing and showing it to his therapist. When the therapist saw this artwork, he was completely stunned. And meanwhile, Cameron was still talking on and on about all of the mistakes that he had made, pointing out different parts of the picture that he had planned on fixing and adjusting details of. But his therapist very quickly interrupted him and told him that this was a beautiful picture. Cameron had drawn this stunning portrait of his sister, and the details of the image were so immaculate that the therapist said that this looked almost lifelike. Over the next several years, art is what eventually helped break the guilt and depression that Cameron suffered from. He continued to work on perfecting his technique, and by the time he was 20 years old, he was already a very well-known person in the art community for his very lifelike portraits and drawings. He ended up opening his own art studio, started giving these large-scale art lessons, and it seemed like this passion for art had really saved his life. Even though he was very young, his career as an artist really took off, and he started to acquire a lot of wealth very quickly. With this wealth, he did want to give it back to the community in a way that he thought was meaningful to him and his own life journey. So in honor of his sister, he set up something called the Ophelia Harding Foundation. Cameron would host these donated art auctions, including his own pieces of work, and do donation art classes in order to raise money. All of the money from these events would eventually go towards funding missing persons units in detective units, as well as setting up funds to pay volunteers that would assist in searching for these missing people. Over the years, Cameron raised thousands of dollars through this foundation. There were several instances where it seemed like his efforts in raising money, supplying funding for these volunteers, and other resources had truly helped find some of these missing people. In some cases, it was good news, but there were still many other cases that ended up just like his sister. For some of these cases, Cameron would actually go make a special appearance for the families and draw them this elaborate portrait of their family member who went missing, just like he did with his sister Ophelia. He knew he couldn't bring back their loved ones, but he did want to give them something to remember them by, with the hopes that it even brought them a small amount of comfort. On one of these occasions, Cameron traveled about 100 miles to the north to a town called Benella for a family gathering of a missing person named Alma Weston, who was found deceased. Her case was still under investigation, and detectives had very little evidence to work with since Alma had been missing for a little over a year, and her remains were so badly decomposed that the details surrounding her death were nearly impossible to attain. Now, Cameron didn't attend all of the gatherings for everyone impacted by the Ophelia Harding Foundation, but in this particular case, a lot of money, time, and resources went into the search for Alma over the last year, so he decided that this would be a good one to show up to. When he arrived, he presented the family with this large portrait of Alma that was in this handcrafted frame and offered to cover any cost of therapy for family members that might be grieving at that time. When Alma's parents returned home, they put the portrait on the kitchen table and decided that they would figure out what to do with it in the morning. So the next day, they were about to hang it up when her father dropped it and shattered the frame with the picture all over the floor. He set it up on the kitchen table, cleaned up the glass, but when he returned, the family dog was aggressively licking this picture. Alma's father quickly moved the dog away and saw that one section of the portrait had been smudged, but it didn't look like it was damaged in any other way. He put the picture in the closet of his bedroom and then decided that he would just go get a new frame for the picture later that week. Throughout the rest of the day, the family dog was whimpering and whining and scratching at the closet door, and this continued for the next several days. One night before bed, Alma's mother went into the bedroom and smelled something really foul. It was almost like this irony, rotten eggs kind of smell. She had noticed it subtly the day before, but the smell had gotten worse and worse over the last few days. Alma's father looked at the portrait and saw that the spot where the dog had licked it had become lumpy and turned this really deep brown color. Immediately, the dog ran over and started licking the portrait again. And after a few moments, he brushed the dog away and ran his fingers across the spot where the dog had just been licking. When he looked at his fingers, he saw that it was this deep red brownish color, and when he smelt it, he could smell that same irony, rotten eggs kind of smell. He turned and looked to his wife and said that he thought that this was blood. The family ended up bringing this portrait to the detectives on Alma's case, and they did determine that the substance on this portrait was indeed human blood and the same blood type as Alma. Authorities went to Cameron's home with the portrait and knocked on his door. When he answered, he wasn't really surprised because he often got visits from detectives on various cases, and he was very familiar with the detectives in the Alma investigation. The detectives asked if they could come in to look around for a little bit, and at first Cameron was a little confused, but once Cameron saw the portrait that they were holding, he stepped aside and let the detectives in his home. Cameron sat quietly for a few moments and didn't really answer any questions that were being asked of him, but after a few moments he got up and told the detectives to follow him upstairs. Once they were upstairs, he pointed to a door at the end of the hallway and told them that what they were looking for would be in that room. The detectives would ultimately only spend a few minutes looking around in this room before going back downstairs and arresting Cameron. Even though Art had temporarily alleviated Cameron from his deep guilt and depression, he never totally recovered mentally. He continually came up with these scenarios in his head where he would leave school with Ophelia that day, walk home with her, and fend off whoever was the one that took her. He would routinely draw these portraits of the two of them walking down the road together and of her walking by herself with a stalker behind her, and these very detailed pictures of her body laying in the forest. And over time, he became more and more consumed with what it actually felt like to be his sister and what it felt like to be her stalker. Cameron did say in his confession that he never thought this was going to go as far as it did, but he did go on to explain what happened to his first victim and all of the rest. His first victim was 19-year-old Sienna Vontish. She was a college student looking for some extra money, and Cameron had offered to pay her to assist him with a new project that he was doing where he was trying to capture the true emotions of people in art form. He brought her upstairs to his room and began interviewing her while she sat on the couch, and Cameron would ask her how she was feeling, and Sienna said that it was a little awkward, but overall she was feeling good about the situation. After she said that, Cameron snapped a photo of her and then asked her to show him what scared looked like. She made this face to kind of try to represent fear, and he snapped another photo. But this is where things started to take a turn for the worst. He walked up to her and sort of brushed her cheek and the hair out of her face, and this made her feel very uneasy. And as soon as he noticed that, he snapped another photo of her. She didn't even get a chance to respond when he told her that he didn't really think that she was showing him what scared looked like. She watched him as he went and locked the door to the room and then asked her, "What about now?" And Sienna did start to have this very real look of fear on her face when Cameron snapped another photo of her. It was at this point that Sienna told him that she was very uncomfortable and needed to leave, told Cameron, "Don't worry about paying me, I don't need the money, I just gotta go." But Cameron very quickly overpowered her and told her that she needed to do exactly as he said if she ever wanted to leave, and she agreed. Cameron set up a camera in front of her that would take pictures on a timer. He then put a blindfold around her eyes and told her to stand completely still while he snuck up behind her, grabbing her around the waist, around the neck, and doing all sorts of really bizarre behavior in order to try to elicit this real sense of fear in these photographs. He said that this rush came over him as he finally got a glimpse of what it truly felt like and looked like for his sister and the person that took her that day. But on one of these occasions, when Sienna noticed that Cameron had walked past her, she pulled the blindfold off and bolted for the door. She began tugging on this doorknob when Cameron grabbed her from behind. He wrapped his arms around her neck and she pried at them until eventually she stopped moving. It would be a few days later when he disposed of her body in a nearby forest where it wasn't found for another several weeks. Cameron would go on to confess to an additional 7 murders that took place in a very similar fashion. He had several cameras set up in his room where he would stalk, torture, and ultimately end the lives of the people that he had abducted or had convinced to come with him into the upper room of his house for some sort of art project. He used these photographs to draw these very elaborate portraits of what these individuals looked like when they were experiencing what he described as an authentic experience of fear. He even used the blood from his victims to make these drawings. He would mix the blood with this special compound that would prevent it from oxidizing quickly, and kept all of these photos and drawings of his victims hanging in his room in these airtight picture frames. The families of 3 of his victims were given the large, elaborate portraits of their loved ones, like what happened in the case of Alma. These portraits were painted with that special compound that contained the blood of the victim. He put these portraits in an airtight frame that reduced the exposure of the blood to the air, with the hopes that it would reduce the oxidation rate of the blood. But when the frame broke on Alma's portrait and the dog began licking it, the blood on the paint oxidized and began to smell and turn that dark brown color. He would later go on to admit that the Ophelia Harding Foundation was founded after the death of his first victim and was part of this elaborate cover-up scheme so that he would appear less suspicious, but ultimately it was the actions of this organization that got him caught. He was convicted of 8 counts of murder and sentenced to death.